To answer this question, we have first to define what precisely collapse means, because the meaning of collapse is different from one people to another. And we are going to consider two definitions. The first definitions will be the growing difficulties for the poorest to live decently. And the second definition is going to be the impossibility for life on Earth to continue, the concept of Anthropocene, and the question of disparition of our civilization. These two questions are connected. They are not separate. And for example, there is a connection between extreme inequalities and global warming. And this connection is simple. For example, extreme inequalities tends to global warming because the poorest emit CO2, greenhouse gases, and destroy their habitat. They cut wood to cook, for example. But on the other side of extreme inequalities, the richest emit 2,000 times more CO2 than the poorest. That's research of the economist Piketty. And then both questions are linked together. For this question of collapse, we can first ask whether we have listened or not to scientists. The first scientist to address this question was what we call the Club de Rome, and Denis Dupré was the head of the research team in 1972. And what they predict that there will be a collapse in 2013. So that was to say 15 years later. And what happens 40 years later, in 2004, the same Denis Dupré presents a conference and says it's too late for sustainable development. So we can't reach a sustainable pace. We can continue. And so this risk of collapse is not only occurring today, but it's also increasing every year. Here is a graph with the biocapacity and the per capita biocapacity. That is to say, it is the green line. So the green line is decreasing. So what the Earth can give to us per person is decreasing because of the increasing of human population on Earth. And on the other side, there is the ecological footprint, what every person on Earth is consuming, and this is still nearly the same. But the difference is the incapability of humans to keep on the same way. And most of the time it's translated by the simple concept how many planets we need for our global consumptions. And as we can't deny there is a collapse, the next question is going to be, who is going to be in charge to face the collapse today? Previously, it was the religions, the church, and they define a constraint on life, on earth, and they decide what we should do and not do, and this to face the possible collapse. And they explain things in another way. But today, we are not in religion aspect. We have scientists who explain us what is going to happen, but it has to go from scientists up to the conscience of every human before we act. And so there is the need of time to go from scientists, then to activists, and then to politics who try to do things, and then eventually to firms, which are the main actors in our today's life. And the question is on three aspects. We have to think of when we produce things, how it happens. First we have to invest money, then we have to produce things, and then we consume things. And for each part, we have to be more conscious of what is going to happen to change our way of doing things. For example, on the investment side, we have to think of responsible investor. We have to choose what is called social responsible investments in firms, so that firms can produce differently, and we need responsible chief executive officers because they have to choose to implement what is called corporate social responsibility. That is to say, to try to satisfy both responsible consumers and responsible investors. And then we have the demand side, and consumers have to be responsible because by their demands they push to change production. Now we are going to have a glance to both definition of a collapse and to have a glance to what finance can do. First, there is a limited answer of finance concerning the first aspect, which is the difficulties for the poorest to live decently. And then we see on this picture that there is some answer. For example, you have solar energy for the poorest people, so it's part of the answer. You have other answer of finance, which is called ethical funds, and I give you the example of a very important Norwegian pension plan, which is $800 billion a month, quite impressive, and they decide to invest to protect our future. In what way? For example, they decide not to buy Walmart since 2006, and they exclude Walmart because Walmart has done some human rights violation. They try to avoid harms, environmental damages, and for example in 2016 they exclude 49 firms for carbon risk, that is to be coal or shale oils. But even there are some aspects in which finance is trying to do things, the result is quite impressive. What I'm going to call it collapse on different topics. The first topic is what I call the air collapse. There is a collapse on air, for example, in China. In China, it's difficult to breathe in some main cities, and there are 2 million people dying because of small particle matters in 2015. And in Germany, there is still coal. What can finance do? Finance can turn coal to green energy. And for example, they can provide solar energy for poor people in Africa to change their way of cooking things, not with wood, but with solar energy. It is, for example, a solar energy oven on the bottom of the picture. But there is not only air collapse, there is two other collapse. There is water collapse. Here you have the problem of dry lands, the problem of polluted waters all around the world, and the finance has difficulties to manage with these questions. Now we are going to have a glance of the second definition of a collapse. The second definition is the impossibility for life on Earth to continue. And on this question, there is what I call the silence of finance. There is nearly no answer. First question is what I call the food collapse. The food collapse is important because some lands, for example, in Hangzhou, you see in 10 years, where you have lands for farming, now you have houses. And the other question is we are transforming our food into energy for our cars, for example. So this collapse is not managed by finance. This collapse was really predicted by the book Limits to Growth in 1972. They predict that we will get problems for food between maybe, you see you have two lines, and the red lines is available surface for food production, and it goes down because some lands are used for other purposes. And the required surface to feed all the humans is increasing fastly because the number of humans is increasing quickly. And they have predicted two possibilities. With the yield for crops, production, if it was the same in 1972 with no change, we'll get problems nearly in 2000. But if we multiply the production by 4, we'll get problem still, but in 2015. So it's only a problem of time, but we'll get problem. There is another collapse that we are completely in, is what I call the life collapse. And every of us know that in 30 years, between 1970 and 2010, nearly 40% of all species have disappeared. So that's quite impressive. And life is collapsing. But the last collapse we all are here about is the climate collapse, what I call the climate collapse. And the climate collapse is the most important one. And this collapse, we try to manage it. And there are conference of parties who try to manage with green gas emission. But their commitments are way off the target. On this graph, I present the past emissions in blue, the blue line. And what is the problem? The problem is that the Conference of Party 21 agreement in Paris promised to limit the annual emission in 2030 at a certain amount. And this is the red star. So it's what we promised to do. We are not sure to do it, but we try to do it. But now what we should do is define, not to change too much the climate, so that we can perhaps manage what is going to happen. We should limit the change in temperature at 2 degrees. And this is the target. And to achieve this target, we have to follow a line of emission. And this line of future emissions is the orange line. So we are way off the commitments. And this target, to attain it, we have to diminish by something like 5% every year, which is quite an impressive number. Did we manage to this target in the future? What was done in the past? In the past, this target of -5%, a decrease of emission, only appears 2 times. First time it was in the 1929 crisis, the most important economic crisis, and the other one was in the World War II. So that means if we want to target the 2 degree, it requires a strategy of wartime to diminish things. It's not a simple way. And what finance do? Finance do few things. Finance help, for example, to compensate your carbon emission. And for example, you promise people to erase their carbon footprints, emission when they take a flight. And this has nearly no effect. We have seen it in the past emissions. So, finance fail on this second definition of a collapse. What is our question now? It is what ethical finance should do. It's not doing this thing, but it should do. And to prevent what? To prevent, for example, what happens in Saint-Martin, French island, in September 2017. And those climate deregulations are happening all around the world today. And what finance should do, we are going to try to see it for the 2 targets, the 2 definitions. We go back to our definition. We have 2 definitions for collapse. First one, reduce inequalities. Second one, limit global warming. And we are going to see for these 2 targets, what can finance do? Let us go back to our way of examining this problem. We first say, well, we have to say what is going to happen in the investment part, in the production part, and in the consumption part. And on all those aspects, we are taking our 2 definitions of the collapse and to see what finance do. And happily, we have plenty of possibilities and plenty of things to do in finance. So we have a future of work in finance. And we are going to go through all these possibilities. The first possibility is to limit credit in order to target the objective of avoiding the collapse, defining as reduce inequalities. What happens? Here is a graph. For example, it's what explained Stevkins, an economist. And he explained that when the level of debt is too high, there is a crisis. Other economists don't say it and don't want to introduce this question in their model. But you see it, it's the ratio of the American debt divided by the annual production. And if you take this ratio, what you see that in 1929, it was the crisis, the level of debt was really high in the States. And this level of debt climbed up at the same level of the level of 1929 in 2005. That is to say that 3 years before the crisis of 2008, we can say that there was too much debt. So the economy is supposed to collapse. We can predict it. And we have to understand this question. And to understand this question, we have to understand the bubble effect of a crisis. And what is an economic crisis, a bubble? It is first an economist boost and then an economic collapse. And I take a simple example, the simple example of Brazil. In Brazil, you have a glance to the economist boost. First, from 2005 to 2014, everybody is happy and everybody buy new things and make debt. And you see that the level of household debt, burden and payments was nearly 20% at the very beginning. It was very low, and it climbed up to 50%. 50% of household payments and revenues goes to the debt burden. It was too much. Too much so when the collapse happened in Brazil, what happens? Those people with high level of debt have lost their jobs and they go back to the slums they were coming out before in the economic boost. So that is the problem for people. But it's not only a problem for people, it's also a problem for nations and countries. Let's take this example, which China is producing nearly everything for the rest of the world. Let's suppose this. And so they send products to US, Europe. And what happens? How to pay these products? Those countries pay by debt. So they get indebted and China get credit over all other countries. And it happens when the level of debt is too high, but there is a collapse. A collapse because the one who is consuming can't consume any longer and has to pay the debt back. And how can we manage to limit this effect, which is a natural effect? That is to say, a boost, and then everybody think the future is going to be nice, and then the burst, everybody think it's going to be worse every day. How to limit this? There is a possibility for finance and economy. It is to control the debt level. And we have economists, Fisher, for example, in 1930, after the crisis, they proposed what is called 100% money, a technique to avoid over-indebtedness. And this was proposed by our Nobel Prize, Maurice Allais too. What's the purpose? The purpose is to limit indebtedness, that is to say, to control it by the central bank. What is the usual way? Central bank lend €1 to a private bank, and today a private bank with this euro lended can lend €10 of credit to borrowers. It multiplies the credit by 10. And 100% money is to say, if a central bank lends €1, the private bank can only lend €1. So that is to say, the central bank is controlling the level, the amount of credit. The second possibility to reduce inequalities is that finance should limit bets. What is the purpose? The money supplies in US is $15 trillion. What is the world production every year? It's about $70 trillion. What is the total value of the world stock and bond market? So all the firms' price and all the debt prices, it is $200 trillion. But there are new financial products which are called derivatives. You can bet on the bankruptcy of a firm, of a state. You can bet on the future price of oil, of corn, of whatever you want. And those amounts of bets in financial markets are $600 trillion. That is to say, every human on earth bets $100,000. Every human. If you don't bet this amount, it means that somebody is betting it for you. And we have proposed with Marc Chenet, which is a professor at Zurich, professor of finance, and Paul Jorion, we have to propose to prohibit finance casino. That is to say, most of these bets. And we precise in our paper, no bet on bankruptcies. No bets on bankruptcies on firms or states. No dark pool to permit control. And for example, no high frequency trading. So that's a possibility for finance. Another possibility for finance is to work to maintain peasants. At first glance, it has no connection with finance. But it is very important because maintaining small peasants, which are disappearing today, is a huge question. A third of the humanity is living as a small peasant. 2.5 billion of small peasants are working every day. And what can we do in finance for them? We have still to limit speculations on commodities. For example, in this graph, I present the price of corn. The price of corn, you see, is very volatile. It is changing at quite an impressive rapidity. That is to say, the volatility is very high. The price can be 3 times the price of 1 year before. It is very impressive. But what is the leading aspect of this price? The leading aspect of this price is, you see in the blue line, it is the price of oil. That is to say, the price of corn is induced by the price of oil. One question later is, who is making the price of oil? And you have all had courses of economy. And the answer is simple in economy. It is the confrontation between offer and demand. Okay, it is this for every of us. And this was the case before 2006, because you see, it was not so volatile at this period. The price was up, but not so volatile. But after 2006, it is very volatile, the prices. What happens? Since 2006, it's no longer what we have learned in economy. The people who are making the prices are the gamblers using financial derivatives. And they are the most important on the markets. I give you the answer. Crude oil, the production every day is 90 million barrels per day. So we produce this number every day. But we bet on the price of how many barrels every day. We bet on prices on 1,500 million barrels per day. So that is to say, speculation on the future price of oil is more important than the production, nearly 20 times. So gamblers are making the price. And if we want to stabilize the price for peasants, we have to limit speculation on commodities, financial speculation. And we can do something else for these peasants. We can promote fair credit and fair trade. Those peasants need not to be over-indebted. They need to have very limited credit. But we can help with what is called in finance crowdfunding, with ethical funds that can finance these peasants, with microcredit. Plenty of opportunities, new techniques in finance. And we can buy peasants' production at a fair price with fair trade. So we have possibilities in finance. There is another important aspect to reduce inequalities, to avoid this kind of collapse, is to stop corruption. And you can see in the money laundering process, when you want to benefit from your corruption, you need banks. You need banks all the time. And so banks have to be controlled for this. And what is the amount of this corruption? It's not so important, but it's quite impressive. It's 2% of the world production. $2,000 billion per year. And what finance can do, banks should be condemned for money laundering. They should be condemned very, very hardly and not softly, as it's today. And even ethical funds should blacklist banks condemned by money laundering. That's the point. There is another point which is tax evasion. And on this aspect, there should be very strict position of the law. And there is a little cartoon explaining what is the consequence of this tax evasion. In my country, they want to renovate hospitals, and in yours, even worse, they build schools. So we need money, we need tax, and we have to stop tax evasion. Is finance concerned with this question? I give you a few examples. This is a small building, but who declare their profit at this address? This address is in Delaware. It's in United States, and it's a tax haven. And in this address you have companies belonging to Trump and Clinton, but you have also companies belonging to Apple, to American Airlines, Coca-Cola, Walmart, and 200,000 other firms in only one small little building. And you have plenty of buildings all around the world. This question is of tax evasion is a fundamental one and is linked to not only to people but to main firms. And it's the case for European firms too. Here you have the localization of subsidiary companies of the 15 largest Euro multinational conglomerates. And where are they? Most of them are in tax haven, in Cayman Islands, in Luxembourg, and so on. So the purpose is tax evasion. This is quite an impressive amount, and when you know that nearly 1,000 firms control 60% of the world production, and for example, 50 American firms have a lot of subsidies in tax havens with $1,400 billion. And what could finance do? Ethical funds are quite important today, and they should blacklist firms in tax haven, which is not the case today. So we can do plenty of things on this first aspect of a collapse, concerning the poorest people. But what can we do for the other aspect of the collapse, which is the global warming, the question of the global warming? And on this side, we have too many possibilities. First of all, we have to change the way the creation of money is made around the world. What is called quantitative easing in finance concerns 1,000 billion euro per year. It's the European central banks that manage that every year 1,000 billion euro is created. And what is the way it's done? This central bank, ECB, lend this money to private banks, and then those banks make credit to indebted states, to multinationals, to hedge funds, to what they want. There is no constraint. Is it possible to change things under the constraint? And what constraint are we thinking of? The constraint we are thinking of is to manage, to try to transform the quantitative easing into a green quantitative easing to address our main question of the collapse. So that the question is going to say, well, okay, for the 1,000 billion euro money creation, but it has to target green concerns. And so this money is going to go to banks, and then the banks should finance green bonds or green energy companies, green transportation, energy savings. So to transform this creation of money and to focus on our main targets. There is another main question now is to limit the production of energy that causes greenhouse gas emission. And this is a very important question because we have to stop financing extraction. And today you have listened that main French banks decide to stop investment in such companies. But if we target a global warming limited at 2 degrees, it requires leaving underground 80% of coal, gas and oil. It is something very impressive. If we don't do this, we are going to go in extreme temperature changes. We'll never be able to manage. So, what is the first aspect finance can do? The first one is that financial investor should be aware that there are 2 trillion stranded assets. That is to say, $2 trillion of money invested in firms that are managing energy in coal, oil, so on. And those assets are in danger because if we decide to stop this, it's going to be worth nothing. So that's one way finance can act. And so the first way is carbon stranded assets, and to prevent investors that they may lose economic value before the end of their expected life of assets due to changes in regulation and technology, to market forces, to environmental concern and societal norms. That's very important to change this. And the other way is to try to help investors to invest in other companies. And so there are what is called low carbon indexes. And those low carbon indexes are a way for investors to invest in company and have a lower carbon exposure than that of the broad market of the weighted companies. For the whole question of this collapse, and the global warming, there is a proposition, and this proposition is a 6,000 billion investment And this solution was proposed to reach the 2-degree target. And it's available online. You can get the report, a French report, which was given to our presidents. And it estimates the cost, which is 6,000 billion per year during 15 years, to transfer our way of producing energy and to reach the 2-degree target, which is our aim. And what are some of the proposals? Not all, but some of the proposals is first the progressive carbon taxation, which is going to be up to 80 euro per ton in 20 years. And this is also to guide investors with portfolio allocation strategy to permit to invest in firms in line with the target 2-degree. And this was proposed by a firm which is Carbon 4. And what can be created too is a line of products, of ethical funds, but dedicated to energy transition. And they should include, for example, some constraints. And I list some of the possible constraints, but we have to decide together what would be the exact constraint. For example, it could be forbidden to buy common goods. It could be forbidden to finance companies that evade taxes. Those ethical funds should invest only in countries with sufficient transparency. They should promote investments in the energy transition. They ensure fair lending rates to avoid unsustainable debts. They promote local financing by local investors, and they promote small business. So we have to create this type of fund. So finance can be, on both aspects of our definition of collapse, part of a solution. But the question is not only finance. The question is finance our master? And if finance is our master, it's going to be a contribution to collapse, because it's going to be every man for himself. And in this case, we know what happens with the tragedy of Titanic. The survival rates of a tragedy, the richest are more chance to survive than the poorest. So if finance is our master, it's this way. And it's going to contribute to the collapse, because today the individual strategy to face the coming collapse is to strive to get richer, and we know that it contributes to the collapse. So the strategy, our strategy, is not the good one. So the question is how finance can help. Finance can help only if finance is our servant to avoid the collapse. And what does it mean? It means that we have to decide collectively what we want, what we oblige finance to do. And we have to decide if all the possibilities of finance I've presented, you want to impose it. We want collectively to impose it by politics. If we want to impose it, we can get out of this question of collapse and limit the collapse. If not, finance is going to be our master. And we have the Titanic, which is in front of our future. So thank you to everybody.